The more I hear that music, the more I get so like I'm dancing in the background, like waiting for that. It's so funny. Hey everybody, welcome to another Dev Chats. My name is Cecil Phillip, and I have my teammate CJ joining me today. And today we're going to be talking about something really cool. Hopefully you guys think it's cool. We'll learn how to accept payments in your Ruby on Rails applications with a really cool open source project called Pay, which is created by our friend Chris Oliver here. So, Chris, why don't we start off super quick, and why don't you tell us who you are and what is it exactly that you do?
Sure. I'm a Ruby on Rails developer, have been for, I don't know. It's been a long time, since like 2010, I think. So over the past quite a few years, I started doing some screencasts, teaching Ruby and Rails development and building a few applications out of it and implementing Stripe in pretty much every actual product. And so that led into building a template called Jumpstart Pro, which is a Rails app that has payments and other things out of the box. And as part of building that, I decided to extract and open source the wrap around the Stripe integration, which is Pay. So that's kind of the high level of what I've been working on.
I'm guessing things must be going really well because I noticed you got a very big check that's sitting behind you right there.
Yes. Yeah, we hit, I forget when it was, like August or something last year. Or maybe it was, I can't remember when exactly it was, but hit the $2 million milestone in
That's awesome.
revenue through Stripe, which is pretty, just doesn't even really compute. It's kind of wild. You never really think you're going to make it that far, and then somehow it just keeps growing.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm sure like everyone that's been using your packages and your services really appreciate it. So thank you. And I hope you get to find somewhere really cool to put the check, maybe on like that right side wall or something like that.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, my new office, we moved in like a couple weeks ago, and then immediately the week after left for vacation. So
Yeah.
It's kind of a mess here. Apologize for that, but yeah, that Stripe check is gonna go somewhere in here
Awesome.
pretty soon.
Cool. Well, I really want to talk to you about Pay, your project. But before we do that, let's switch over. I'm going to switch over to my screen. Let's look at some updates about some cool things that have been going on in the world of Stripe. So first thing I want to talk about today. So, some folks may or may not know about this, but we have this really cool project called Link. And essentially what it does is it allows you to like pre-fill like some of your customer information, like, maybe like their address, even their credit card information, if you have them as like, an existing customer or something like that. It's really just like an easy way for them to quickly, hey, I want to buy your product. I'm going to click the button, pre-fill my information, and just kind of get going, right? Like it's like having those really quick conversions. So I realize a lot of folks don't know we have stuff like this. I want to share this document. This is over on our docs. If you head over to stripe.com/docs/payment, you should be able to see in the menu bar like something for Link, and you go ahead and check this out. It's really easy to integrate. Relatively easy to integrate. Works well with like payment elements and like a lot of the other features we have. So if this is something that makes sense for your projects, definitely make sure you check it out. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about. So one of our community experts, Jacob, he wrote this really cool blog post about how you can start accepting mobile payments if you're building like React's native applications. And he says we can do it in 15 minutes. So I've never written React Native, so I'm gonna test it. I'm gonna put this to the test, and I'm gonna try and see if I can do this in 15 minutes. Not on this show. I'm gonna do this on my own off camera. But if again you're a React Native developer and this is something that you want to do, right? You want to add payments to your application. Definitely take a look at this. I'll make sure I put the links for this inside of the chat, and we can try and make sure that we get those inside of the description as well. So if you're watching this video later, you can go ahead and check this out too if you wanted to. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. So our another one of our community experts, Orlando. He has a really cool YouTube channel. You should head over to his YouTube channel, Landing Feedback, right? Make sure you go ahead and subscribe. But he has a video talking about how you can, use our Stripe pricing tables. Now, this is a beta feature. So that means that it's not, it's not turned on for everybody, but it's coming soon. But it's a really cool way of, when you have like those tiered pricing models, you can give your customers like that visual of, hey, well, these are the different options you have. I know in the past, a lot of our customers have just been building it manually, doing it themselves. Well, you don't have to do it yourselves anymore. We'll do it for you um, with this new feature that's coming up soon with on Stripe pricing tables. So I want to show those with y'all really quick. Again, I'm going to put those inside of the chat for folks that are here and hanging out with us. And again, we'll make sure those are available in the description. So if you want to take a look at those later, you can go ahead and do that. But now is the part where I always say, hey, it's no longer our show. Now this is Chris's show. So we're gonna switch over, Chris. We're gonna focus on you. And let's talk a little bit about your pay project. And I guess the best place to start is, well, why did you make this thing?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things that you, if you build like an integration with Stripe or any payment provider, really, you're going to probably do it slightly different every time you build an application. And there's a lot of stuff that you need to sync and model in your database and everything. So I decided like it might be nice to have a open source package that defined the models, the routes, the webhooks, the helpers, just to kind of make and simplify the integration so that you don't have to learn, hopefully, all of the Stripe stuff that might be required to, for example, implement checkout. So you can have the checkout process happen. The webhooks can come in and sync the customer information and the payment method they used, and you could use that to like
Yeah.
set their default source and everything. And so that was kind of the idea behind it, which was like, what if we did the full sort of integration out of the box on top of the Stripe library? And you can always dive into specific things with the Stripe SDK and Ruby, just like you normally would. You just get a little bit of sort of an abstraction layer to make it simpler and hopefully focus more on like, let's just implement the subscriptions and not have to worry about all the little nuances of payment methods or whatever it might be. So that was kind of the goal of Pay, and it's definitely evolved a lot. Version 4 we just released that like, I don't remember, very recently, and
Yeah.
it's just been one of those things like iterating on it, and you implement webhooks and you realize like, I can't necessarily trust the data in the webhook right away, so I need to actually listen for the webhook, pull the information from the API, and make sure I have the latest stuff. And that's like things that we've done for you, so you don't have to deal with those issues sometimes.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're on Black Friday and 1,000 webhooks come in all of a
Yeah.
sudden. We'll write them to a queue and then process them in the background. And your code might actually just accept all the requests and try and do it right there in line. So, trying to include little best practices and things like that to make the integration easier for you.
And I like what you said earlier is like it provides that abstraction, but if you really needed to dive down into that core Stripe API, you still have the option to do that, right? It's not like you're
Yeah.
hiding it. It's like an extension and you're just appending to it with like some nice features and best practices to make life a little bit easier for everyone else that's trying to like consume, payments inside of their application.
Exactly, because that's the reality is like, there are a million different ways to do subscriptions,
Right.
and I don't want to like force you into using some simple things and then all of a sudden I have to rip Pay out because I can't do some like extra little feature I need. I'm intended so that it is just, it's there, it does the basics, it makes that simple, and then when you need to expand on that, great, just do it, and
Awesome.
so I don't want it to limit you in any way when you're integrating it. And for as best as we can, that's how we've done. There's some things where you're like, okay, well, we need to create an abstraction which needs to actually limit some thing.
Right.
And so maybe there are certain features that are like, yeah, if you're going to do that, just skip Pay or whatever. But for the most part, for your standard kind of subscriptions, one-time checkout, even we have like full Connect support, so you can do marketplace payments and all of that stuff with it too. It kind of should do pretty much everything as best as we can out of the box to keep it really simple. So
So I'm glad you kind of started going on that road. You mentioned Connect. I'm guessing that does some checkout stuff, webhooks.
Yep.
Are there any like what are like some of the other features that you'd probably want folks to know about like that this gem can do?
Yeah. So the majority of it started out as we're going to make it kind of seamless when you create a customer. You might collect a payment method. If you happen to send that in, we'll go ahead and update that default before we charge your customer. We can do subscriptions. The subscriptions have all of the new stuff for tax and multiple line items and um, all kind of as much as that of that as we could support within reason. I know there are some little things that are like, uh, tiered pricing and whatever. We don't handle some of the like, your pricing page or anything like that. So we just kind of handle everything behind that. So it's kind of limited in that sense that we don't like do the UI and everything for you yet. Maybe we will, but we focused mainly on one-time checkout subscriptions and then expanded into doing Stripe tax and the different types of subscriptions. So instead of just having a kind of Netflix, you subscribe to a single plan. Now we have metered billing. We have helpers for Stripe checkout, the billing portal, and then all of the Connect stuff, which is actually super cool. Like when you create a Stripe customer with Connect, Pay is going to automatically include the Stripe account for every charge and subscription you do going forward. So it kind of ties them in your database to the Connect account. And you don't have to worry about that ever. Like we're going to always include those account IDs and everything for you so that it's all handled accordingly. So that's the main focus. It's mostly for like one-time checkout and subscriptions in SaaS territory or whatever. But we're getting into lots of people asking about marketplaces and whatever. So that's kind of where we've been heading in the feature development and stuff for it.
Nice. All right, so I'm ready, right? I got to see what this looks like. We've been talking about this for a long time. So would you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Maybe we can see some demos and see what it feels like and look at the code and learn like how exactly we could use this.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
And your screen is up now. Yes, sir.
Cool. So yeah, you can find Pay on GitHub. I've got a whole folder of documentation that you can read through. There's a lot that it'll do. We're going to just focus on a quick demo that's a Rails app that has some content that we want to put behind a subscription. So the installation and everything is pretty straightforward. You can just hit the install doc and you'll add the PayGem and Stripe. And if you want to have like Braintree or Paddle, you can use that. But we also have our own receipts. So if you don't want to use like the receipts that are built into the billing portal or the Stripe emails, you can use the receipts gem, which I also created, and it will generate PDFs for you as well if you want to have your like white labeled experience. So we're going to go walk through this in a little Rails app. And let's just go ahead and bundle add Pay and Stripe. And that will add the latest versions of Pay and Stripe to your Rails app and install them. And then once we install those, we'll run the migration command here to copy over the migration file, which has all of the models inside of it for your database. So if we pull this up, this migration is going to create a table to sync our customers from Stripe, our merchants, payment methods, subscriptions, charges, webhooks. We don't have every model that you would have, access to with the Stripe API. So if you want to like query refunds, for example, you just do that directly instead of like syncing them to our database. We're trying to balance that and keep it simple and not like cover every single thing because that would be pretty hard to maintain. But
totally.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm super curious, like how you landed on this specific like modeling. Like I know some people will store
Yep.
the Stripe customer ID like directly on the user, and then maybe they'll only have one subscription that has just a subscription ID and status. Like, what kinds of things have you run into that have
Yes.
like helped you push your way into this specific modeling?
You're pulling up some old feelings that I ran into myself, where the original versions of Pay were like, oh, go add these fields to your user model. But the problem became anytime I need to change those, there's no way to like tell the user, hey, you need to like go change those models. Um, and I actually ended up migrating that stuff to our own Pay like prefixed model names, because then we can control it. And this is effectively the same thing that Rails does itself for, active storage, action text. They have their own action text models, the rich text model, and so on. So then Rails can just provide those other migrations to add other fields or change things as needed. And it doesn't, it kind of nicely separates out the developers' models and the ones owned by the library, like Pay.
Got it.
So
So
that
it's like
was,
it's a combination of like, okay, this is a best practice. If you're building a Rails engine that happens to manage models, it's probably a good practice to like keep those models separate. And then separately, or like, yeah, it's like a completely separate concern, like, okay, this is how you have discovered through 4 versions that is like the best way to model a SaaS business, or like at least this is the data that you will probably want in your database.
yeah, and that's yeah. I would say like going real fast back to the database stuff, like the paranoia or discard or axes, whatever, like the soft delete
Mm-hmm.
gems, like those are ones where you might want to actually put a field on the developers models. But when it's like all this stuff that's kind of something they will never change, but you would as the like library owner, it makes sense to separate this out from their tables. And then yeah, this has kind of become it's evolved quite a bit because there was a lot of these things that I didn't necessarily use at the beginning. And like, for example, payment methods, we had one default payment method and that's all we ever saved. And so we didn't really need to keep track of anything. But over time, people are like, hey, well, why can't I see the other ones? Why aren't you syncing that? And I was like, okay, well, we'll add that table now. And so these have kind of evolved over time of like, we did the bare minimum, the first version, and over time we're like, you know what? We should probably save webhooks in the database so then we can queue them up to be processed. And that's what Action Mailbox does in Rails. When you get an inbound email, it'll save it in the database table, then queue up a job. If it fails, it's got the record in your database still. You can retry it and do whatever you need to keep track of status or whatever on those. So these are all kind of things that for the most part are like trying to be the bare minimum of things that you would need
Mm-hmm.
without being too restrictive. So a lot of extra stuff I've started to put in like a JSON column that you probably aren't going to query on very often. But for example, on a subscription in the data column, we'll now store like the pause behavior. So we know like the subscription is active on our status, but it's actually paused. So we'll have that information there. We can add and remove that stuff a lot easier than adding and removing columns. So I've kind of like tried to balance stuff we will always absolutely need as regular fields, and then kind of store the extra stuff in JSON columns. We'll see long term if that's a good solution or not. But when it comes to something like the pause behavior, there's a couple fields, and I don't want to add like subscription settings or something for nested data like that. And so this kind of makes it easier to map stuff accordingly there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing with all this too is while we primarily support Stripe, there is Braintree and Paddle support, and even a fake payment processor for testing or whatever. So this stuff kind of has some extra things that might be it tries to be generic across them all, but we have to store like the payment processor name for each one. So if this is Stripe, it'll say Stripe. If it's the fake processor, it'll say the fake one, and so on. And so there's a little bit of that just to keep it organized on, when the customer is checking out with Stripe, here's all their payment methods for their Stripe customer object, but they might have 2 or 3 set up and be able to switch between them. And that has just been kind of a long-term feature that I wanted from building Go Rails. Like I'll have Stripe checkout as the main thing I want to send people to, but there are people who don't have a credit card, and at the time I just send them to PayPal, and so it was like these 2 whole separate things, and I really wanted an abstraction layer over the top that was like, hey, here's one interface I can use, and it doesn't really matter if they chose Stripe or PayPal. We can just kind of have the code written as equivalently as possible. It's not always the case because lots of little options change between them, but for the most part, you can kind of get away with it for standard checkout or subscriptions or whatever.
Cool.
Nice.
So I'm also, if you'll let me ask, like, I'm assuming this JSON column type thing is something you would really only need to worry about as a library maintainer, because my assumption or my gut is saying like this allows you to like work with JSON and different database types and things, or
so we support SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres. And if you've ever used the JSON field types across those, as Colin and I were working on earlier today, like they just simply don't work the same. Like one of the recent versions of SQLite introduced the like double arrow operator. But that's like not available on Ubuntu Linux by default. It's like a version too far or too early for the long-term support release. And so what I did here was like the migration is going to check and see, hey, are you on Postgres? Because if you are, let's use the JSON-B column type instead of JSON. And we can kind of, adapt those as needed. For the most part, I think Pay doesn't actually query on those, but the other benefit of having something like that is, if you are on SQLite, you can choose how you write the query so that it's compatible with SQLite instead of, whatever you might need to do in MySQL or Postgres, which might be slightly different. Like MySQL has the $.dot in the field name, but if you do that in Postgres, then it just returns null. So it's kind of like one of those things that if you do start getting into that area of databases and you want to actually be compatible with them, you have to spend a lot of time just writing your own little exceptions here and there.
And that's like a lot of the reason for that is because Active Record doesn't give you like really strong native tooling for working with JSON columns. Like if you want to do a query, you just have to like write your raw, like whatever it's called, your where clause or your projection, like, and then that will be converted into whatever underlying database management system you're using. So
and we have like in the notice gem like a giant thing that will check to see which database adapter you're using, and then like chooses which accessor to use to query the data. And so it's like something you have to implement yourself. Maybe eventually it could go into Active Record, but it's one where it's like, that's something they've got to maintain as the library, owners, and whether or not they want to actually maintain that is up to them. And so that's probably why, this stuff is still in flux. Like the feature in SQLite is like February or something when it was just added the double arrow. So like it's all still pretty recent for some of these things.
Got it. So cool. One of our folks in the community, so Steve McCardle, Steve's here like every week, every time we do something. So quick shout out to Steve. But he made this comment. This is why we use Mongo. And I had a question in the back of my head now. I'm like, well, how extensible is Pay, your Pay gem? I mean, can I use a different database or whatever the case is? Like, Can I
Um,
add my own support for Mongo, or is this something just based on how like the active record inside of Rails works?
Yeah, I mean, we just use Active Record. So Active Record doesn't support Mongo, so there's not
Got it.
really, any support for that. I'm sure it's doable. There are gems that have like their Active Record and their Mongo support, like Devise or whatever, and it's definitely doable. Like somebody could make a pull request for that, but um, we're not really doing anything that would really benefit from that. Like,
Yeah.
so it's not really something that makes a lot of sense for us, developing
Got
pay
it.
to go out of our way to support. So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay.
um, shall we continue?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
Let's
let's
go.
do it.
So once we got the migration installed, and then the next step is really just to add those fields to your database. So all of those tables and fields get added. One of the things that we do have you set up is the default URL option, so that when we create, like we're going to use Stripe checkout in this example, when we create the URL for Stripe checkout, so it can like send you back to your site. Um, we'll use this by default in order to generate the right domain. So what we'll do is we'll go into, you can do this any way you want. You can either do it globally in the application RB, or I'll probably put it in environments development.rb. We can just drop that line here at the bottom and say this is going to be localhost 3000. So that's as simple as that is. Pretty much just define that, and that'll automatically be detected by pay. The other thing that I'll point out is that you'll want to set your Stripe API keys and your webhook signing secret. So when you are using this locally, you'll want to use the Stripe CLI to listen to the webhooks to actually sync over everything, just like you would in production. And one of those things, it's going to print out your webhook signing secret, so you're going to want to grab that. And you can put them in environment variables, so Ruby can access them in your env as either the Stripe public key, the Stripe private key, and the Stripe signing secret. And I've already set these up, so I'm not going to walk through that. But you can check out the docs for how to set that either in your environment, like in production, or in your credentials for each of your environments. Just wanted to point that out because I've already set it up. Didn't want to share those on accident, but those are all good. So then the next step of setting up pay is really just to tell it, what models in my application are going to be assigned or associated with a pay or a Stripe customer or a pay customer. And so we just drop in pay customer into our model. And if we go into user.rb, we can drop that in here, and we can even say default payment processor as Stripe. And that will skip a step where you can have it automatically create a Stripe customer for you. And this is one of those features I think that CJ, you worked on, if I remember right.
I definitely asked for it, so
Yeah, I
thanks
can't.
for
I think we like paired on it or something, but
yeah,
it's
we
like
worked
super
on
handy.
something. Yeah.
Because in general, you'll have like a user record in your database, and you will like say set payment processor to Stripe, and that will switch your default payment processor to Stripe. So whenever you add pay customer, it'll add some methods. This is the one that you will use first if you don't have this. And once you've set a payment processor, you can just say, hey, payment processor, let's charge my card, or let's subscribe to a plan. And so these methods are all added as part of this payment processor. And behind the scenes, this is actually just an association, which is cool. It's like a has one payment processor association, and it returns the pay customer record for that. So it's just like a handy name alias almost to a standard old association that you'd be used to in Rails. So once you have this, you can start thinking about what you want your application to do. So let's actually boot up the Rails app and open this up in the browser. What I've done is I've created a Rails app that just has Bootstrap. It's got devise for users. We'll sign up real fast. And let's imagine that we're building some, a Go Rails or a Udemy or anything that might have some content that you want customers to subscribe and pay for. So this would be like some secret content. This should only be visible to paying customers. And we can create that. And we want to hide this and only show that to people who are subscribed. So with pay, we can go into the lesson show HTML ERB, and we can say if the user is signed in and the current user payment processor is subscribed to our application, we'll display the content. But otherwise, we can print out something like you must subscribe to access this content. And we can have a link to some subscribe action. And for now, we'll just have this as a button that goes nowhere. And we'll make that work here in a second. So we want to make sure that this is working and hiding that content. So in order to make this work, what we can do is implement a redirect to Stripe checkout. They can subscribe, and then when they come back to the site, they'll have access to everything because all of the webhooks and everything will be handled by Pay for us. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a route in our Rails app. We'll say resource subscription. And this will be a simple app where we only have a single subscription, more or less, that we'll handle here. And so our code for this can be pretty simple. We'll go into our controllers, and we'll implement that subscriptions controller for these routes that we just added. Subscriptions controller. We'll want to make sure that our user is logged in. So we'll say authenticate user, and that comes from devise. And we'll just make sure that if you hit this URL, that you're logged in as an account. And that's going to help because we're going to be able to have a user to associate with the Stripe customer. So then we can have the user in our database connected directly to the customer inside of Stripe. So we'll have a new action here, which is going to create a checkout session. And this is some of the stuff that Pay does for you. So if we have the payment processor, we don't need to set it to Stripe before we do this because we've already done that on the default payment processor option we set. So here we can just simply say checkout. We want our mode to be subscription and our line item to be a Stripe price. So if we go into my Stripe dashboard, I have a handful of random test subscriptions. We can grab the ID for this one and paste it in as an example. We can redirect our user to the checkout session URL. We don't really even need this to be an instance variable. We'll say allow other host is true because Rails is going to now protect this by default. So if you redirect to a separate domain, you'll get stopped and you have to pass this option. And we're also going to pass the status of see other so that Turbo handles that accordingly. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and set up the billing portal as well. So the billing portal session is very similar. We'll say portal session and portal session here. And just billing portal is all you need to call. That will go and generate a billing portal session for you, give you the URL back, and you're good to go. So with these two controller actions set up, our lessons show HTML ERB can link to the new subscription path. And if we want to be complete, we can also go to our nav bar and we can find like a section in here where you're logged in, and we can have a link to the billing portal. And this will be the edit subscription path. And if we go to our Rails app, let's just make sure that our Stripe CLI is working. I have had this running, and it's been sending requests to our Rails app. Pay has automatically handled this. We use this /pay/webhook/Stripe as the default route for all of the webhooks. So you'll just want to make sure that they're coming in and returning 200s. But once that's done, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, like, I found it kind of handy to edit the proc file and just drop in like another process that's Stripe, and then fire up your Stripe CLI listener, so that like anytime you boot it up, you don't have to forget or go check like, oh, did I start that thing? So
yeah, and that's like super duper handy. The only trick is just whenever your webhook signing secret changes, you'll probably get like an error or whatever, and you just got to change that once every 60 days or something. It is really nice to put this in your so putting this in your proc file is definitely the way to go. So I think everything is functional, so we can line items needs to be plural. Wouldn't be a live demo without something going wrong. So line items. This is one of the examples of something that like we handle for you. Like you typically will send line items as an array, and you've got to like pass in the price and the quantity and whatever. And we have several things set up here that if you give us an array, we'll pass that directly over. But if you give us something like a string, we'll convert it to the array of line items and just kind of simplify the options that you have. So your code can be a little bit cleaner and simpler when you're using Pay to integrate. So let's go back. Let's subscribe again. This is going to take us to our Stripe checkout session. We can go ahead and set up our favorite card and subscribe to our brand new application. And this will take us back to the homepage. One of the things that you can do is you can use the session ID, which will automatically include in the URL that is generated here. That's one of the things, another one of the many things that Pay does for you automatically. We inject that into the URL, and we'll use the root URL by default. So you can use the session ID to look it up and actually fulfill like a one-time purchase, or if you want to like just sync and make sure that the user's subscription has been synced, because the webhooks will be syncing in the background. If they're delayed, the user could come to this page and see the subscribe button still. So that session ID is one way of Pay making it easier for you to just guarantee that their subscription was sent over. But because it worked automatically in the background, we are now subscribed, and we can see our pro secret content that only paying customers can access. And then when we click on billing, it'll take us to a subscription edit, jump us over to the billing portal, and all of this will give us easy access to like invoice receipts and everything, where we don't have to implement that, which is one of the awesome things of the billing portal. But one of the benefits here that I want to show is if we were to go in to the customers list and actually do customer support, maybe this person said, hey, I accidentally subscribed and I didn't mean to, and you've got somebody that just jumps into your Stripe dashboard. If you cancel the subscription, that will trigger the webhook. We will automatically handle it, and now they're unsubscribed in the application. And you didn't have to implement any webhooks. You didn't have to implement any of the syncing. everything is done for you there. And also we can jump into like the database and look at the pay customer last, and we'll see, the customer is created. We do some of the stuff like lazy creating the customer. So you can say, hey, I want to use Stripe, but we don't immediately create the customer just to keep it a little faster. So you can like walk through these steps in whatever order that you need. But we can then go and say, hey, what's their subscriptions? And you have access to their subscription that is now canceled. And you have access to all of their information, like the subscription items, the metered billing. These are things that are going to be unique to Stripe that won't necessarily be on the fake processor or Paddle or whatever. But we give you kind of the data that you probably need, because if you're going to be using metered billing, you're not going to be using the other payment processors out there because they work totally different, if they even support that, and generally they won't. So it's kind of expected that in like some applications, if you're going to use a certain billing style, you're going to stick to whatever processor and just work with that information. So some of this stuff is available, but isn't going to be like perfectly equivalent on each payment processor. But this is, giving you all of the details that you would want if you actually wanted to build your white labeled integrations. That's actually what Jumpstart Pro does, and was the reason why I built Pay in the first place. I didn't want to use, Stripe Checkout didn't even exist, if I remember right, when I started. Mm-hmm. And so, we're listing out all your subscriptions on our own custom page and generating PDF receipts for you. And, all of that stuff is actually custom and white labeled. So you have the ability to, in a few minutes, go implement Stripe Checkout. It's fully integrated, but also go from there and build your own white labeled checkout, or use our own in Jumpstart Pro that's done for you. And you have all this data in your database. You can go and run analytics on it if you wanted to, or whatever you might want. And all of that stuff is kept in sync so that, so somebody does an action or Stripe does an automatic, invoice for a subscription. That stuff's just going to automatically sync to your Rails application using Pay. And you don't hopefully have to touch any of that. It should all work out of the box there. So yeah, that is kind of the quickest, simplest implementation of subscriptions. I guess I should point out that like one of those things related to the database design that we ended up settling on. This was inspired by Laravel Cashier. They allow you to have, just like Stripe does, multiple subscriptions for a single user or customer. And we give each of those subscriptions a name. And so when in our code, we were looking at the lesson show. Oh, we're already there, blah, blah, blah. This subscribe method can take a name, and you can give it something else like, team
Enterprise
or enterprise. Yeah. And so you can use this to designate the different types of subscriptions you might have. So Intercom's a good example where they have like, you can subscribe to everything, or you can subscribe to specific features, and you could use this to query those subscriptions based upon like their type, or as we call them, the name. But you can also filter down as well and say processor, plan, and this would be your price ID is whatever. So if you had something very specific you cared about, you can have that in there as well. And those are like going to default. As you see here, the name is default by default, of course. So when you call this without arguments, the subscribe method is going to look for a subscription named default, or all of the subscriptions named default. And so that's, a little nuance that is really useful to know about. You might not quite wrap your head around it if you are poking around the database and you're like, why is there a name and why is it always called default? That is why. So
Along those lines, Cecil, I don't know if you'll let me like
Go for it,
indulge in a
man.
few
Go
more
for it.
questions. Yeah, so I'm super curious, like your approach or your recommendation around preventing people from accessing stuff that they're not allowed to access. Like here, we're seeing like, okay, yeah, we have a conditional that just checks like, are they subscribed? Um, in practice, would you say you're going to build like a before filter that you apply to certain controllers? Would you build like a parent controller that's like everything that inherits from this, you have to be subscribed? Would you use like can, or you know what I mean? Like, yeah, kind of
Yep.
what would be your favorite sort of approach here to authorization based on subscriptions?
Yeah, it probably depends a little bit on the application. This is an example that like I've used in Go Rails for the longest time because it was either I display the video or I don't, and
Mm-hmm.
the page is still the page. So if you paid or you didn't pay, you would still come to the same location. Um, so this is like the very simplest version of it, where we're like, hey, just hide the content and that's it. If you have areas or sections of the application that are like, hey, we don't want you to access these unless you're paying, then yes, I would probably take this and I would go into the controller and I would go into the lessons controller and say something like before action require subscription or something like that. And we could just say require subscription and redirect to the pricing path or whatever that might be, unless the current user is subscribed. And they may or may not have, they should actually have a payment processor as Stripe. Um, but sometimes I'll do the safe accessor here as well. This, I don't need to check if the user signed in. This would return nil. So I can simplify it and say, hey, if the user's nil, then their payment processor is probably nil and the subscribe is probably nil. So we can make it all kind of a clean thing here. And then um, going further, yeah, if you have something more complex where it's not just a simple, are they paying or are they not paying? It might be which plan are they paying for? Then I would use something like pundit, action policy, or can. I tend to prefer pundit or action policy over can. And the main reason is like it's just Ruby classes. It's really, really simple. There's some added like features and performance stuff and whatever that they've done in action policy to kind of build over top of pundit, but pundit is like the simplest one to get started with, and you can use that to kind of say like let's find your subscription, and then let's check and see which price you're on or your processor plan, and then say, okay, you have access to this feature because you're on whatever plan. So it depends on kind of how fine grained you need to be in your like authorization around that, but for the most part, the these simple tactics work great if you're just caring whether or not they're paying or not.
Cool. Yeah, Willard is like, yeah, I'm a huge fan of pundit all the way. Here we got JF, so I think like maybe that's the community favorite there is the pundit gem. So the one other thing that I wanted to ask about was when you first migrate the database, you've got all these pay tables in there. Is there a way to like populate those with data from Stripe? Is there like a rake task or any like helpers that would be like backfill all of my subscriptions or customers?
I sort of. The problem is that because we associate your like user record with a Stripe customer, we would need that information ahead of time in order to backfill. So some of that is easiest to backfill if you have the Stripe customer and user database user association already, established. Otherwise,
Mhm.
like we can pull in the Stripe customers, but we have no idea who they are. So, you
Mhm.
know, and generally that's hopefully going to be matching on email. So it should be pretty straightforward for you. We don't have anything for that specifically on the customer side, but I don't remember if we had a task in here for syncing other stuff. I know we did for syncing payment methods because we introduced that feature and we needed to go backfill all of those payment methods. All of the subscriptions and the charges and most things have a sync method. So, like a subscription will come in either from you subscribing or a webhook or something happening. And we'll just say pay Stripe subscription sync, give it the ID, it'll hit the API, grab everything it needs, grab all the tax stuff, and expand whatever fields. And so, if you wanted to go through the Stripe API, gather all the subscription IDs, you could just run them through the sync methods yourself, and that's all easily done and accessible. So I'll show you an example of this. If we go to the Stripe charge, the sync method is pretty long, but you can give it a charge ID, and if you want to skip the API request, you can pass in the object. And if you didn't, we will go retrieve the Stripe charge. We'll expand the discounts, the tax rates. We'll include the Connect account on there. We'll automatically retry if for some reason you get rate limited or whatever the case is. And then we'll go through and try and find, was there a customer? If this was a guest charge, we don't even sync it. It's not really something that we may end up doing that in the future, like guest checkout stuff and recording those. But for the most part, we're concerned about associating that with an actual customer in your application. So then we'll go look it up. We'll go find the payment method details, and we have a bunch of stuff that's like, hey, if it's a credit card, we got to go look it up under this key, and we'll try and handle as much of that as possible for you. And then grab all the information that is relevant about the charge, and we're keeping track of stuff like that payment method that they had paid with. We want to make sure, like you guys do, save the information about that payment method, because it might be deleted from the user's account, and if you deleted that and you're just storing a reference to it, then it's gone and you have no history of that payment information. So we keep track of some of that, even though it's maybe a little bit redundant. That's good for accountability later on. And then we'll go through and associate a charge to a subscription, because charges, we don't just sync invoices, because charges can be outside of an invoice. So we have those handled separately if they were related to an invoice, syncing all their line items and everything, and keeping that up to date. So you can use this, and this is like one of the big pieces of the application, just making sure we sync all the information down to those tables correctly. And so generally that's like a feature that every model has. So in theory, if you grab the IDs from the API directly, you could probably just pipe them through this stuff, and it would probably take a long time and you get rate limited, but you could.
Sweet. Okay. Perfect. This is super cool.
Yeah.
This looks awesome. So I have to, we're running a little bit low on time, but I have to ask you super important question before we do anything else. And that is, so obviously I work with CJ, me and CJ are teammates. And so I've seen him work and I'm watching you work. And I have to ask, do all Ruby folks use Vim? Is that like Ruby thing? I have to ask the
Definitely
question.
not. I think
Okay.
I would say the majority of them use probably VS Code these days.
Okay.
But yeah, Vim, I don't know. I spent a lot of time working on servers and stuff, and I wanted an editor that was kind of, always there. So I can SSH into a machine and Vim's there. And, I also was watching other developers, and I spent a while thinking about, I'm at the computer for however many hours a day. How do I be efficient? And watching some of my friends go through their editor, and they'd use the mouse and then highlight something and then delete it. And I'm just like, like, let's just go use the keyboard and not jump between the mouse and everything. It's so much
Mhm.
faster and
Yeah.
whatever. And some of those things I picked up and was like, yeah, let's learn Vim, because everybody that I've watched, like Ben Ornstein, who is really
Mhm.
good at Vim and really fast to the point where sometimes watching, what was it, like the Destroy All Software screencast, like watching
Mhm.
Gary Bernhardt.
Gary. Yeah.
He's incredible at editing text, and I'm watching him like, I want to be that fast one day. So that was kind of the stuff that pushed me to learning Vim. And I came from like Sublime and used a package called Janus for Vim
Mhm.
that was like a lot of the keyboard shortcuts from Sublime that I could just use in Vim, and it helped
Mhm.
me like actually get up to speed instead of the first few times where you're like, I'm so slow. This is
Mhm.
going in the wrong direction. And if you can find the equivalent, or like just turn on Vim mode in VS Code and start there. It's not the exact same as real Vim, but it's close enough, and you can pick up a lot of things and still have some of the helpers in your GUI editor that and like I'm using Mac Vim, and Neo Vim works similar, I think, where you can use your mouse and still use it like a regular editor. It's not like you're in your terminal and you can't use your mouse to navigate. You get a little bit of those helpers if you set it up, nicely, and try and make it easy for you to do the transition, not just go cold turkey into your Vim in your terminal. But
Yeah, it's I don't know, like I think one of the things about Vim that I think is really powerful and beneficial is like the mindset of modal editing, like being able to switch between modes. If you're if you're editing, or if you're building anything with software, a lot, like most of your time is actually spent editing. And so I think we lost Cecil, but he'll be back. Uh, so yeah, most of the time is spent editing. And so the faster you can move around, find different files, find the right line that you need to change and make the change as quick as possible. Like for me, that's kind of what, uh,
yeah,
yeah.
and that brings up a good point of like, have you ever done something that is, if you're new to it and you're not efficient, you can, like, your brain can be 5 steps ahead of what you're
Mhm.
actually doing. And when you can optimize editing your code to be as fast as the solution is coming together in your head, and you
Mhm.
can get that out onto paper
Mhm.
or whatever, that is really important for you to just be as efficient as possible in your brain, solving problems and thinking about like, should we even do it this way? You can write it out real quick and then be like, yeah, that's definitely wrong. And then it takes a it like makes it more fluid. I remember like learning to drive a manual,
Mhm.
and just being like, I don't understand, like I'm at a stoplight and I can't figure out how to start the car. The
Yeah.
people behind me are like honking at me, and I'm just like, this is weird. I know what I would normally do and where
Mhm.
I would normally be, but I'm so slow. And it had a lot of like similar feelings to like editing and trying to learn Vim or whatever, and just
Mhm.
trying to be as smooth as possible between your thoughts and what actually is put out. It can be like really tough, but if you can get efficient at it, then you can be way faster at trying new ideas and testing things and whatever else. So
Totally. Yeah, I love so I don't know if it was Ben Orenstein or someone, but there was some talk at some point that was like, if you can um, if you can navigate your code with your eyes closed, then it's like, then you've sort of like unlocked some really high level of, being able to edit and move around. So like, yeah, if you want to think like, okay, I'm going to jump to this controller, you should be able to close your eyes, Command P or whatever your fuzzy finder is, type the file name, hit enter. And then if you know like what line you're going to, you can do like a slash to search down for that thing. And so, yeah,
hmm
yeah, I don't know.
yeah, and that's something that I'm probably going to do a screencast on soon. Colin and I were talking about like, you know, when you build any feature, you are like thinking about it in these different, well, at least in Rails, you're thinking about it in models using controllers and helpers. And like any given feature is going to span those quite a bit. And any of that jumping between like, oh, I need to go to the controller and that's in this folder and whatever, any of those, stop your train of thought of like, we need to put this code here. And you're now like, where the hell is this file? What folder is it under? And you start to forget some of those things that you were like meaning to do. That just like had come up this week and was like related to kind of how do you organize your code, like for the subscription stuff, for authorization, like you were talking about earlier, like where does that belong? Because you can put it in the views, but you can also put it in the controllers and you can put it in Pundit. But if you put it in Pundit, then you have to call Pundit from the controllers and the views, and you can end up putting the logic for the authorization in one place, but you still have all of those separate things that need to talk to that and ask it questions. And it's really interesting thinking about, building features, in any capacity, because you have to think about how do all these tie together and how do we actually make it like one cohesive thing, and not spaghetti everywhere. And that's always forever a problem that never goes away.
Totally. Cecil is back.
Hey, folks, I'm back. Sorry about that.
No, welcome back.
Well, you'll have to watch the recording where Chris and I talk about.
Yeah, I gotta go and catch up on all the stuff I missed.
Our love of
the
them.
last couple of minutes.
So,
I think we're at time now. So Chris, I think this was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank everyone that's here that has been like hanging out with us so far. If you want to check out Pay, which I'm hoping all of you will, definitely make sure you head over to the GitHub repo. What I'll do, I'll get the GitHub repo real quick and I'll put it on screen for folks that are interested in it. But definitely make sure you head over to this GitHub repo. The link should be at the bottom of your screen right now. And then, Chris, I also believe, I don't know if you talked about this when I wasn't here, but I believe you also have courses too that you could pay for and watch. And, if you want to get up to speed with getting started with taking payment in Rails. So I'm guessing that's an option too, right?
Yeah. So there is, if you go to courses.gorails.com, there is a Stripe, there's a Payments with Rails masterclass or something, and it walks through actually all of the behind the scenes that Pay does, but doesn't actually use Pay. So if you want to learn how all of that works conceptually, that's a really good course for it. Because using Pay abstracts so much stuff, there's a lot of little nuances like strong customer authentication and whatever that we walk through every single piece of the way, and we would put them in, the same locations we wrote a lot of that code. Today, you would put all that stuff in there and more. And we do the full like white labeled integration and stuff. Not we may cover checkout, but I don't. It may be a bonus or something, because the main thing was like, let's go implement one-time checkouts with a cart, and then let's go do a subscription and talk about all those things. What do we need to save, and what information is important to keep around and query against later on and stuff. So
Gotcha.
that goes through all of that, and it's a really good course. It was the one that I made and was like, man, I would happily have paid $500 for this. When I was learning the first few times, and so I was like, I'm happy to be able to offer that and hopefully save people the same amount of time that I wasted.
For sure. Awesome. Well, again, Chris, thank you so much for being here. Thank all of you for watching. And make sure you come back and hang out on our channel. Subscribe to the Stripe Developers channel on YouTube if you haven't. And we're going to have more amazing content, more dev chats, and more of our other shows as well. So that being said, thank you all so much. And I'm looking for the funky music so we could get the outro. Have I found it? I found it. Found the funky music. All right. Thank you all so much. Take care. And thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye, friends.